to earn the right to take on the games, sometimes diverting lots of money in public funds, transforming their cities completely, and to what end after the games are done. 2 years ago, we saw the 2014 Winter Olympics, which was the most expensive Winter Olympics in history with a price tag of over $60 billion, more expensive than all previous Winter Olympics combined. And it was hosted in the geographically inconvenient and temperate city of Sochi, Russia. 2 years ago, we also saw the 2014 World Cup hosted in Brazil, for which the 12 stadiums that were either built or completely refurbished have begun falling into disrepair. And this year, in a couple months, we will see the 2016 Summer Olympics hosted in Rio, a city that faces many challenges: debt, corruption, poverty, now disease. And this Olympics comes with a price tag of the reasonable $20 billion and countless other costs that are difficult to calculate. Several athletes have already expressed concern about Zika, and some will not be participating. The protests in Brazil might be unprecedented in Olympic history. Some athletes have gotten sick from practicing in unclean water. Now, how many fans know this? How many of you knew some of these things? Right? So arguably, due to increasing media attention that isn't completely provided by network sponsors, the information is out there. But how many of us will still watch the games? I love the Olympics. We love the Olympics. There's nothing that represents our society, human ability, better than this display. But can we, in good conscience, continue the love affair? So with that, let's introduce our panelists. This evening we have Dave Zirin. He's the author of Brazil's Dance with the Devil, the World Cup, the Olympics, and the Fight for Democracy. He is sports editor at The Nation magazine and host of the Edge of Sports podcast. Jules Boykoff is the author of 3 books on the Olympic Games, most recently Power Games, a political history of the Olympics. His research and writing on the Olympics has appeared in academic journals and international publications. He is a former professional soccer player, a Fulbright Research Fellow, and he currently teaches political science at Pacific University in Oregon. Cameron Myler is a 4-time Olympian in the sport of luge, an 11-time World Cup medalist, 7-time national champion, and was elected by her teammates to carry the U.S. flag at the opening ceremonies of the 1994 Olympic Games. As an attorney, she practiced intellectual property law for a decade, then joined the faculty of the NYU School of Professional Studies Tisch Institute for Sports Management, Media, and Business. She served on the U.S. Olympic Committee's board of directors and on an IOC working group involved with developing 2020 Olympic agenda, and is currently a member of the Court of Arbitration for Sport. Our moderator for the evening is Kostya Kennedy. He's the editorial director at Time Inc. Books and the author of the best-selling 56, Joe DiMaggio and the Last Magic Number in Sports, as well as Pete Rose, An American Dilemma. A former senior writer and assistant managing editor at Sports Illustrated, he has covered numerous Olympics. He teaches at the NYU School of Professional Studies Tisch Institute for Sports, and his new book, Lasting Impact, One Team, One Season, What Happens When Our Sons Play Football, comes out in September of 2016. So this is our panel, and I would like to say that we'll dedicate a good amount of time to discussion, but we also will have time for questions. At that time, we will indicate the mic is open. Please make a single file orderly line. Make sure your questions are questions and not statements. And without further ado, let's give a welcome to our moderator and our panelists.
Thank you, Brendan, and thank you, everybody, for coming. Rachel, thank you for the vodka bottles. We're going to talk about a lot of things, but I think the first thing is the mosquito in the room. Last week, there were about 150 health experts, at least one of whom is in this room tonight, who signed a petition saying that because of the Zika virus, they believe the Olympic Games should be either postponed or relocated, something the World Health Organization is not of a mind to do. What do you think, Dave?
The mosquito in the room. Very nicely done. It's interesting because I was just in Rio. I spoke to a lot of people about Zika. I spoke to Dr. Rodrigo Grindero, who's the head of the institute at the University of Rio, who are attempting to figure out how to manage this. And I've come down on this question the way a lot of the activists in Rio come down on this question, which is like, if we're going to talk about protesting or boycotting the Olympics because of police violence or because of corruption, sign me up. Sign me up. And for a lot of these folks down there, they're like, yeah, that's why we're going to be protesting. We're going to be protesting for those very basic reasons of displacement, militarization, and unfathomable debt. Sign me up. The question of canceling it over Zika seems bizarre to me, and I want to say why. And a little, and I don't mean to cast aspersions on any of the 150 people who signed this thing, but also a little bit of a first world misunderstanding of what life is actually like in Brazil and Rio. A couple things. First, just to be clear, when I spoke to people about the Olympics, it was almost every time me who had to raise the issue of Zika when people were talking about their concerns that had to do with the Olympics. To the point where I had to be like, well, why aren't you talking about Zika? And their answers were twofold. The first thing, almost invariably what people said, is, look, first of all, we've lived with dengue here for decades. You know, mosquito-borne diseases are a fact of life for us, and this is something we manage and try to live with the best that we can. The second thing is that they have the very real fear that, you know, one of the things that's actually putting a cattle prod on the behinds of Brazil's notoriously corrupt health officials and public health services to do some of the basic things to actually fumigate and the rest of it is Olympic fear. And the idea that any kind of public will to do something about Zika will dissipate if the Olympics move. So that was two of the reasons. Then the last one, and this is why I mentioned the first world thing is, and not understanding, is that people talk about like we're going to avoid a global pandemic by moving the Olympics, and I think that ignores the fact that Rio is already a global city. Like the idea that Rio is this isolated place and people are only coming there for the Olympics to see Rio, and otherwise they wouldn't be there, is absurd. Over 5 million people visit Rio. The number is actually between 5 and 8 million of people who visit Rio every year. It's a stop on the global tourism train. Carnival, which just took place, had over 1 million people travel to Rio. And that's at the height of mosquito season. And that's the last part, is I wonder if people even realize that August is like winter in Brazil. So it's not mosquito season anyway. And so I understand the concerns about health. I would never, ever in a million years disrespect an athlete who said, I don't feel physically safe going there because of Zika, and then that's why I wouldn't go. I'll stop on that, sorry to go on too long. But it's just to say that I think that when we're talking about our list of Olympic concerns, Zika is high on that list, but I don't think we confront Zika by moving the Olympics.
Okay, so you sound like you're pro-Zika.
Yeah, I'm pro-Zika.
Anybody and...
I have pamphlets afterwards.
Do you guys have anything else to say on the mosquito issue?
Definitely. I think what often happens when we start talking about Zika is we start worrying more about people who will be traveling to Rio for the Olympics, and we worry about athletes as well. Almost all those people have a choice whether they're going to go to Rio or not, and what all too often gets lost in the equation are people living in Rio already who will get a little bit of boost of fumigation, and maybe will get to go to the streets and protest and get some more attention for some of the deeper social programs that are necessary to fend off poverty, which in turn will help fend off Zika. And so to forego that opportunity in the name of protecting first world tourists is not something I necessarily jump up and down all excited about. For me, what maybe is interesting to really keep an eye on as we move forward is to think about the relationship between the World Health Organization and the International Olympic Committee. They signed a memorandum of understanding back in 2010, July, and they've been asked to reveal what it was that they said in this memorandum, and so far they haven't. It is a private document, but still, if there's nothing to hide, you'd think they just put it out there. Most of these things are sort of bromides anyways. So I think there could be a real conflict of interest here, at least worth looking at. And if there is no conflict of interest, fine, just explain to us why there's not. Because the World Health Organization has been the real bottle stopper on this one, and they're the ones saying no worries, and they have a lot of good doctors working for them, and they're saying we shouldn't cancel the games. Last point on this. One reason why I'm a little bit skeptical of the World Health Organization and think they need a second look is because when I lived in Rio from August through December of this last year, I interviewed the people who wrote that blockbuster story in July 2015 about how water quality at all the Olympic venues was horrific. Like if you drink 3 teaspoons of that water, you have a 99% chance of catching a virus thanks to human sewage. And they told me that they really wanted the World Health Organization to do virus testing. After all, that was a big issue in the water, not just bacterial testing, but viral testing. And the World Health Organization at first came out and said, yeah, let's do that, let's do virus testing. And then they're like, oh, no, let's not do that. Yeah, let's do that. No, let's not do that. Basically flipping and flopping on the issue, which really raised a lot of questions like, hey, we have the money, we can do this. This isn't like mystery science, it's a viral test. So I think something to keep an eye on as we move forward is the relationship between the World Health Organization and the IOC, the National Olympic Committee.
So Cameron, as an athlete, whether it's Zika itself or another health issue, leaving aside for a moment some of the other political issues, how much does that play in when you have a chance to go to an Olympic game? It's a big deal. You have a choice, but in some ways you don't. It's what you work for, your life. How do those kind of health issues, whether it is a Zika or there was SARS in Asia, how do they impact the way you look at your opportunity?
So this might be the only question that I'm in agreement with my other panelists on the answer, but I also agree that the Zika virus is not reason enough to move the Olympics, and the sort of logistics of making that happen are nearly impossible. I've been asked the question a number of times in the past few weeks, and people are suggesting, why can't the IOC move the Olympics to Beijing, or what about Sydney, or what about some other location that has hosted the Olympics previously? And the reality is Rio and Brazil have been preparing for the Olympics for 7 years. It's that long in advance of the games that a city is awarded to be the host city, and it's a 42 sports, just the Olympics, not counting the Paralympics, but 42 sports with 306 events over 19 days of competition. So logistically, I would say impossible. And from the athlete's perspective, I competed in the Olympics 4 times, and I had the good fortune of having a very long career, but that's not the case for most Olympic athletes. Most go one time. Like, you have one chance to compete in the Olympics, and that's it. And many athletes, Olympians and Paralympians, train most, if not all, of their sort of sporting lives to compete in this event, as Brendan so eloquently described, as this sort of pinnacle of human achievements. So as an athlete, if I were named to the team this summer, I would probably think twice about going because of Zika, but I would go. And that's just my personal opinion. I certainly wouldn't want to make that decision for anyone else. And everyone, it's certainly voluntary. As Jules said, no one is sort of making anyone go compete in the games.
So do you think that any of these other issues, issues about clean water and the political situation with the president who was effectively impeached and bribery scandals, did that matter? Does any of that matter to the, I don't mean in the human sense does it matter, but in terms of the Olympic Games? Like, does it matter to a willingness, an eagerness to participate, an eagerness to consume and all that, or not? How are they related?
So I think those are two sort of different kinds of issues that you raised. One, the water issue, that's something that athletes may be thinking, oh, like, I need to obviously consume water at the venue. I want to be safe. I want to know that I'm competing. If I'm in the rowing event, I don't want to fall out of my boat and then get dreadfully ill as a result of the water infected with bacteria and virus. So I think there are some issues that affect athletes directly. And the other issues, I would say, athletes think about these things, yes, but I don't believe they would necessarily factor into making a decision to not go to the games.
Yeah, so Flint, Michigan is just now applying for the 2020 games after hearing about the border situation. They've got a lot. What about you guys? From a, not from a strictly athlete perspective, but just from a human perspective, why, how is it related? So what if Dilma Rousseff is manipulating budgets? Why does that have anything to do with the Olympics, or does it not?
I think it has a great deal to do with the Olympics, and that's my fear for the games. First of all, I can't even get the words out of my mouth to say Dilma Rousseff was impeached. I mean, I think she was the subject to a highly organized judicial coup. A president who was just elected 18 months ago with 55 million votes finds herself forced out of power, being judged by a Congress, 3/5 of whom are under some form of investigation right now or indictment. And as I was telling my friends, the Shirazis beforehand, like Dilma Rousseff, who, if you read my book, you'll see, I have tons of criticisms of Dilma Rousseff, the Workers' Party, how they've chosen to organize their government, the deals that they've made with the IMF and the World Bank. There's no shortage of ways to criticize Dilma Rousseff. But in the vast buffet of Brazilian politics, she might have been the least corrupt person in the room when they voted to impeach her. I mean, she's basically impeached for accounting tricks, which all predecessors in Brazil had done, while she was being voted out of office by people who are being investigated for things like, I don't know, murder. I mean, it is a vile set of circumstances, and because everybody in the Brazilian Congress is trying to cut a deal to stay out of prison, and because they're all wired at all times to get tape on their sisters and brothers in the Congress, one of the things that we're getting is a lot of wire leaks. And one of the things we now know for a fact is that the Supreme Court, the military, the idea of diverting people's attention away from this larger scandal, which, by the way, Dilma Rousseff is not implicated in. It's called the car wash scandal, involving the laundering of billions of dollars. And so this was very, very highly orchestrated, and they took advantage of the fact that Dilma Rousseff was a woefully unpopular figure. But if we just impeach people willy-nilly for being unpopular, then George W. Bush should have been gone by 2005 after Katrina. So hey, maybe that's not a bad idea. But to take it back to this, it's like I really, given the political context and given my own fears that the Olympics are going to become kind of this grotesque theater where whoever the new leader is going to be celebrated in this parade of nationalism right after this horrific injustice took place. And knowing that people are going to be protesting in the streets against what they call, the global golpe, globo being the media conglomerate, golpe meaning coup. I think that an athlete who chose to make a political stand on the question of democracy and not having the Olympics being used as a prop for a coup, I think that would be very admirable and we should greet that with all of our solidarity.
Yeah, I just want to say there have been a few beneficiaries of the crisis, and I think the crisis, the political and economic crisis, absolutely matters for the Olympics. There have been a few major beneficiaries. First and foremost, the people who have taken over the government in Brazil have pushed forward pretty quickly processes of privatization, selling off the resources of the state. I mean, it's incredible. So they're benefiting. They obviously benefited politically because they've gotten positions of power. But perhaps a less intuitive beneficiary has been the Olympic organizers themselves, because at this point before an Olympics, there's always intense scrutiny on the organizers of the games. And they've essentially been given a free pass compared to previous organizers in similar positions. And so they've benefited as well. A lot of their foibles and missteps have not gotten as much coverage as they would have otherwise. It also matters because some of these same companies that have been pulled into this Lava Jato car wash scandal that Dave was mentioning include Odebrecht, which, by the way, the head of that company got 19 years in prison for their shenanigans, illegal shenanigans, which is kind of refreshing when you think about what goes on here in this country. At least they know how to put people in jail to carry out these financial crimes. But they have a lot of projects that are related to the Olympics as well. And Dave mentioned the wiretaps that keep trickling out. There was one from the 7th of March this past year between Lula, former President Lula, and Eduardo Paes, the mayor of Rio. And Eduardo Paes is really nervous about the Olympics. He said to Lula, he said, I'm managing my crisis too. So he's well aware that the Olympics are on unfirm footing right now, and it very much is related to the political crisis at hand.
You know, obviously it's a very intense time in Brazil, and there's a lot of corruption going on. But you also said in there, Jules, that you know, the organizing committee is always under a lot of scrutiny, and so are local governments at the time of Olympics. We heard a lot of stuff in Athens and Beijing. In what ways, apart from the sheer mass of corruption, but in what ways is this Olympics different? I mean, I feel like some of these issues are exacerbated cases of things that we've heard before.
True. I would say a major difference is on the environmental front. There's an incredible chasm that has emerged between the promises of the Rio organizers and what's happened on the ground. Let me just give you a couple examples that are quite striking in my mind. One, they promised to plant 24 million trees for carbon offsets. That was in the bid. And then the environmental secretary from the state of Rio de Janeiro said, oh, that's not enough, we're gonna do 34 million trees. Well, a recent study found that they're on pace to do 8.1 million trees, okay? So they're way off their goal there. A bigger one, and it's probably even more important for everyday people of Rio, is the water issue. 80% of the water was supposed to be treated that entered sites like Guanabara Bay, where they're gonna have sailing, or the lake, where they're gonna have canoeing. 80% was supposed to be treated, and that was before the Olympics. The governor from the state of Rio de Janeiro said recently, oh, we're not gonna be able to do 2016. It's actually gonna be 2035. You know, meanwhile, there's these mysterious fish die-offs happening where just like thousands and thousands, tons and tons of fish just float to the surface in these places that are going to be Olympic venues. So what's different about this? It's like biblical Old Testament what's happening compared to previous places in some ways.
I just say one brief addition to that, and I certainly, you know, since I've already been branded by Kostya as pro-Zika, I don't want to be branded either as pro-Brazilian government in terms of how they've done this, but as a way to not excuse what Jules said, but explain it, I think we also have to keep in mind that when Brazil won these Olympics, they were rocketing along at an 8% growth clip. They're on the cover of The Economist with the Cristo statue blasting off like a rocket ship. You know, everybody wanted their money in Brazil at the time. You know, and you fast forward to now where the economy is in contraction. And what's so scary though is that when the people, I think, realize this, but like when you sign up for the Olympics, that money's pretty locked in. So while they're cutting here, there, and everywhere to make the math work to the best of their ability, they're still set to have to spend $10, $20 billion on the Olympics. And that's meant that things like, in the context of the Zika virus, health subsidies have been cut, for example. Health subsidies in the midst of this crisis, by Dilma, by the way, were cut because for this crisis. Another example is that people might have read about the spate of police killings that have taken place in the favelas. The spate of police killings, I interviewed some local politicians who were protesting it, and they said one of the things that these killings is a function of is the budget cuts, because they were trying to do this initiative or the equivalent of what we call community policing, of a police officer on every corner and trying to make connections with the community, what have you. And they're just like, yeah, we don't have enough money to do that. We just got, you know, it's a lot cheaper to just go in and shoot some guns and tell people to stay in their homes. And people have died as a result. So the economic contraction, I think, sort of overshadows this gap that Jules talked about.
Yeah, I'd just like to bring it back as we think about all this stuff. You mentioned, I think, Dave, that you respect an athlete who chose to protest. That's a big thing to ask of an athlete. What's your feeling on that, Cameron?
Well, so being a lawyer, I'm going to turn to some rules, and those are, so the Olympic Charter is basically the rules of the Olympic movement that the IOC creates and that everyone who chooses to participate in the movement, so National Olympic Committees, international federations, including FIFA, and other organizations and individuals, everyone essentially agrees that they will comply with the rules. And so the rule that has to come to mind here is, it's called Rule 50, and part of it says that no kind of demonstration or political, religious, or racial propaganda is permitted in any Olympic sites, venues, or other areas. So that applies to everyone who has a credential at the Games. So if you are an athlete, if you're a coach, if you are a trainer, if you are part of an official delegation from a country, you are obliged to comply with these. And the IOC has, for a few reasons. So one, and yes, I certainly am aware the Olympic movement and the IOC, it's a multi-billion-dollar business. I'm certainly not denying it's not a vast commercial enterprise of sorts, but they have made this rule for among other reasons for those moments when athletes are on the playing field, when they're on the soccer pitch or on the luge track or in the track and field stadium, there's no advertising of any sorts inside the venues. It's completely prohibited. And athletes and others are also prohibited from engaging in political speech. So I agree with the rule. I think it helps sort of protect those moments when athletes are there, sort of living this moment that they've trained their whole lives for. And in London, the IOC, actually not the IOC, but two national Olympic committees sent athletes home for speech that they deem to be political and or offensive. So a Greek athlete, track and field athlete, she was sent home. And I have to say, social media makes it a lot easier for the IOC and other organizations to catch you when you violate the rules. So track and field triple jumper. So this is what she tweeted. With so many Africans in Greece, at least the West Nile mosquitoes will eat homemade food. And the IOC said, you know what, does not comply with our values and what we are about, and the Hellenic Olympic Committee actually sent her home immediately. So she was sent home, a Swiss soccer player who made incredibly racist remarks about a member of the Korean team after the Swiss lost in football, and one Korean soccer player after in that match in which they defeated Switzerland, picked up a flag from someone in the stands, and it said in Korean. So it was sort of the Korean flag, but with language that essentially said Korea owns a set of islands that Korea and Japan have been in dispute over for some years. So the IOC deemed that to be political speech and did not award him his medal with the rest of the team. They actually gave it to him later, and I thought, you know what, like, you have to make a decision. Does it violate the rule? Does it not violate the rule? And if it does, then you should enforce the rules as they're written.
Do either of you guys have an opinion specifically on that?
Please, Jules.
Well, first of all, I would say that you articulated the rule correctly. I would just say rules are meant to be bent and to be broken. And we've seen it in recent Olympics over and over again. There have not been repercussions. For example, at the Sochi Winter Olympics, there was a snowboarder named Alexei Sobolev who, at the end of his run, pulled out his snowboard that had a balaclava-laden clad person who looked like she was from Pussy Riot, and he laid down next to her, clearly a political statement about Pussy Riot, who had been thrown in jail. Nothing happened to him. Cheryl Maas spoke out against the anti-LGBTQ law that was passed in Russia ahead of the Olympics. She flashed her unicorn rainbow glove in front of the camera. Nothing happened to her. Another thing is that at Sochi, because of the fervor around that law, that obviously repressive law that targeted LGBTQ people, the IOC made some changes, and they allowed athletes to speak out at press conferences, which very much pushes up against that rule that you read for us. And I would even say it might even break it, because it says venues or other places, so pretty much anywhere around the Olympics counts for them.
So if I can just jump in, I feel like I need to say that I'm an athlete ambassador for a nonprofit or an advocacy organization called Athlete Ally, which promotes LGBTQ inclusion in sport. And I helped them with their campaign in Sochi that led to the change that you just talked about. So I'm not an evildoer here.
Well done. Are you comfortable, or is it comfortable if an athlete wants to get up and just say, you know, and I'm all behind building that wall to keep the Mexicans out. They want to say whatever they want to say. There's no agenda. They can speak. They can be racist. They can be however they want.
See, full disclosure as well, I wrote a book with John frickin' Carlos. As in 1968, Raise Your Black Glove Fist to the Heavens, John Carlos. He was never stripped of his medal. That was IOC propaganda because they lie in the IOC to keep athletes oppressed and keep them from speaking out. So that actually wasn't true. I've seen John Carlos's medal. It's with his mother in a nursing home. But they certainly made that story. We actually got the History Channel to change their entry about John Carlos and Tommy Smith because they highlighted the lie that their medals were taken away. So it's really asking me, am I glad that John Carlos and Tommy Smith raised their fists and spoke out against racism, against apartheid Rhodesia in South Africa, against Avery Brundage, the fascist who headed the International Olympic Committee for 50 years? Am I glad about that? Hell yeah, I'm glad about that. Does that also mean people will say things I disagree with? Yes, but you know, I think we're in this weird moment politically where someone says a racist thing, which is deplorable, and we all tut-tut and get upset, and that is deplorable, the racist things that were mentioned. But what about the racism of sending military police into the black favelas of Brazil to get ready for the Olympics? That's not political. What about sending 77,000 people out of their homes to make way for the Olympic Park in Rio? And this is a piece of one of the neighborhoods that someone put on a postcard to send people who wanted to protest the Olympics. This is a piece of somebody's home that I'm holding up right here. People can come up and see it for themselves. And the homes that were destroyed are in the shadow of the media center at the Olympics. So the media will literally be looking down at the destroyed homes of people next to Olympic Park. Are we really going to say that that's not political? Are we going to say it's not political when Bechtel is a sponsor of the Olympics, or whatever the hell Bechtel is calling themselves now? And you know, in the advertising industry, they call this, with regards to the Olympics, they call it sin washing. I've interviewed ad execs. They call it sin washing because they know that people, not people, geez, I sound like Mitt Romney, corporations who sponsor the Olympics tend to get a positive feedback from consumers. So you could be a corporation that's like, yeah, we sell stem cell fajitas to the 1%, and yet if you're on the Olympics sitting next to Coca-Cola and McDonald's, everybody starts to love you after a while. And so I'm not saying that these companies shouldn't be able to advertise, but to say that that's not political speech somehow, and the Olympics aren't being exploited for politics by this kind of corporate greed or the kind of government actions that Brazil is taking, to me is just, I just don't understand it.
Well, I've been reading you, Dave, and listening to you for a long time. I only very avidly and happily, and my own thought is I never know exactly how you feel. So thank you for that. Go ahead.
Well, first of all, I think, Cameron, you deserve a lot of credit. That was important that they opened up that space for people to actually talk. It might seem like a small thing, but it allowed some athletes to really say what they think. I'm not worried about athletes speaking out either, and there's one athlete I think we should really keep an eye on moving forward. His name is Lawrence Halstead, and he has qualified for the Rio 2016 Games. He's a fencer from Team GB from Britain, and he recently wrote a really terrific essay for The Guardian where he said, you know, I really believe that athletes should, if they feel comfortable, stand up and speak out on these issues if they feel comfortable. He said that if he doesn't do that, that it seems like he's implicitly saying everything's fine around Rio. And so like Dave was saying before, I think we need to see who those people are, and if we agree with their principles, do stand up with them in solidarity, because they're going to get a lot of pushback from people for doing those sorts of things.
We haven't even talked really about the bid process, but before we do that, we went to talk meeting on how many people are going to watch the Olympics. What about that whole thing? We have Michael Phelps who's going to swim. I'm looking forward to seeing Usain Bolt try to run the 200 meter one more time. And Alton Felix, I'm just picking veterans, lots of young people I've not heard of. Dave, can you enjoy these games? Knowing what you know and seeing what is done, can you, August, well, you'll be down there, but can you watch an event and take pleasure in the athleticism, or what not?
I'm going to be sitting alone in the dark eating organic celery. No, I'm just kidding. Because joy has no part in sports or life. No, I love the Olympics, and I always have. And I love the Olympics because we are fed such a hyper-masculine, monochromatic diet of sports in this country that the Olympics is one of the few times that you get to actually A, engage in different kinds of sports, and B, in the incredible power of female athleticism. And so it's rare in that regard, and that aspect of it I think should absolutely be supported. I just think it's like we gotta watch it with open eyes.
How about Cameron? I'm assuming.
Yeah, absolutely. So I obviously come from this place of having competed myself, and it's a really powerful experience to make an Olympic team, to represent your country, and to compete on the world stage with the best athletes in the world. So I'm really proud that I did that. I'm proud that I carried the American flag for our country at the opening ceremonies. And Dave, to your point, I think the Olympics has helped women's sports out tremendously, and something that I've certainly benefited from, in not just as an athlete, but in my involvement with governance post-retirement. So, and I'll note that it was not until Sochi that women were competing in every sport that men were. So in London, women competed in boxing for the first time. So after 2012, women competed in all summer sports. And then in Sochi 2014, anyone know what the last sport to be added for women to compete in on the Olympic program was? And I have a lot of students in this class, so I better see a hand. Yes. Catherine? Ski jumping, yes. So women compete in all sports now, and it's certainly the sort of that struggle is not over. There really needs to be change in the governance and operation of the organizations that make decisions, because it's only when you get sort of diversity in the decision-making bodies that you get really well-informed and I think better choices. So.
I'm looking for. So when I watch the Olympics, I tell myself we need not devote ourselves to the depth and complexity. We can both appreciate the athletes and take on some of these serious and important issues at the same time. There's a few athletes I'm really excited about. Lawrence Halstead is definitely one of them, I just mentioned. Marcos Vinicius de Almeida, who's the Neymar of Brazilian archery. Really interesting young man. He actually went out to some of the indigenous communities in Brazil to work with indigenous archers and try to help with training. They actually had a program to try to get some indigenous archers to qualify for Rio. 3 came pretty close, but none quite qualified this year. But he was really involved in that and was really smart about the whole thing, so I'll be definitely rooting for him. As a sort of downer side note though, if you look at the Rio bid, the word indigenous is mentioned one time, and it's in a section titled Terrorist Activist Activities. There's so much wrong with that label, I can't even begin to tell you, but that's the only time indigenous peoples are mentioned in the bid, which is amazing, because when I lived in Rio this past fall, there was the World Indigenous Games right there in the country of Brazil. So rich history, vibrant history, alive history, and there's even a museum of the Indio in Rio de Janeiro. So, but there's many athletes. Ittihad Muhammad from the United States, a fencer, will also be participating. There's so many people that keep an eye on.
Let me just bring up one more thing, and then we'll fill it out to question. And that is about the bid process. Some of the issues relate back to that process. Jules, you talked about the promises made during the bid that weren't kept. The IOC demand ridiculous things, right? They demand to have the conference rooms at a specific temperature, and they have to stay in 5-star hotels, and they have to have doves released at a certain time. Seriously. What do you think about that? Even if you're a well-intentioned government, and not to suggest that there are any out there, but even if you were, you have to ingratiate yourself to the IOC. What do you think about what we can do about that? Dave, do you have any thoughts on the bid process, how it could be made better? Is there anything right with it? I know there's a lot wrong.
No, I mean, if you're asking me if I had a Harry Potter magic wand, I would, first I would eliminate the bid process, and then I would split the IOC in two. So there would be a part of the IOC that does its traditional functions, and then another part that's constantly watching the IOC. So and I think, and I know Jules has written about this, I've been talking about this for some time. Given the fact that so many of these facilities that get built just then rot, basically, after people leave, I mean, I think even though we would lose something, I think the most moral task going forward would be if you eliminated the bid process and held the Olympics in a couple of set countries and treated it like the TV production that it's become. And I know there's that part of the Olympics that's sort of like the NBC hosted by Bob Costas travelogue, where it's like, look at beautiful Rio, home of the lambada, or whatever he says. It's, you know, which it doesn't exoticize Rio at all, the way NBC talks about it, not even a little bit. I think that's the most moral course of action, given the social cost, particularly in the post 9/11 era, where everybody who says, gee, I disagree with this house you're turning down, is all of a sudden a terrorist. I think that's probably the most moral way going forward, even if we would lose something.
That close to what, something that you think too, Jules, about?
Well, certainly costs need to get reined in. The bidding process is like economic etch-a-sketch. You say one thing at the beginning, it's only going to cost for London $3.8 billion. Shake it up. Oh, actually it cost, according to some $3.8 billion, goes up to $38 billion. I mean, you mentioned Sochi running at the outset. That takes the cake for Winter Olympics. So there needs to be some kind of process for reining that in. Another thing I would like to see done is to have people stand by their votes publicly. By people, I mean members of the International Olympic Committee. If you support a country based on the technical reports that come to you about the sites, about everything, then you should just be willing to stand up and say, that's who I voted for. I once mentioned this at a forum I was at in Germany that Franz Beckenbauer was hosting, and I was on a panel with the head of the German Olympics at the time. And when I said that, I thought it sounded kind of reasonable, and he practically jumped out of his seat. Impossible, oh my gosh, not that kind of democracy, basically. So I think there's a lot of concrete things that we could do to make the Olympics follow through on their processes, but maybe we can talk more about that later.
Do you have any thoughts on that?
I do. So I'll say that the new president of the IOC, Thomas Bach, is German and actually an Olympic medalist himself in fencing. And one of his initiatives immediately after his took office was to get feedback from all of the stakeholders in the movement. So athletes, organizations, broadcast partners, commercial sponsors. And in this process of creating a strategic plan for the IOC called Olympic Agenda 2020, and he knows there's a problem with bidding, with the cost of the games, and a whole host of other issues to keep the Olympic Games and the Olympic movement sustainable. So part of what the IOC has said that they will address, and they have changed the bid process going forward. So the process that LA 2024 is currently engaged in is a new one. It's meant to be more streamlined, it's meant to cost less, and to give cities the opportunity up front to learn more about what they are really signing up for before they spend hundreds of millions of dollars in the process. So I think it's some change has started.
Is it the nature of the money that's spent on the internationalness of the games that makes us talk about the media perhaps covering this stuff? Dave covered it, Jules covered it, but a lot of people don't. I mean, when we're watching the Yankee game, we don't expect the announcer to say, here's some guy in a $5,000 seat and there's a rising homeless epidemic in New York City. We don't expect that, and we don't hold an announcer to that. Do we hold the media to a different standard, and should we?
I think we should always hold the media to a high standard. No matter the subject, Olympics or not. The fact that we wonder, gee, why won't they look at the Olympics really makes me scared about things like, I don't know, politics and Wall Street. If we can't get them to cover the Olympics, what the hell are we going to do with things outside the field? It's kind of terrifying. I think what's interesting, though, about the Olympics compared to, say, a Yankees game is that the IOC and NBC Sports are so protective of their rights that what you see sometimes, I think, in recent years had amazing reporting come out on the Olympics. ESPN, Jeremy Schaap, if you go back and look at it, have done terrific reporting. And one of the reasons why they do this great reporting is that they can't just show the highlights the way NBC does. So they're there, they got to do something, And so they end up covering what's happening. They end up looking for stories in a way that I think other sporting events don't lend themselves to in the same kind of a way. So I'm actually both optimistic and even excited at just what kind of stories we're going to get out of Rio. And that's part of what Jules was saying too about not moving the Olympics. I know a lot of activists in Rio, a lot of people who are waiting for this moment to be like, I'm going to tell my story. And I'm going to make sure people know how people actually live in Rio, beyond the glitz of what NBC is trying to do. I hope we consume that kind of media, because then that's the second part of it, of course.
Do you guys have something? I'm ready to throw it out there. I could keep going, but if you want to come up, why don't you just step right up?
Yes, let's make a line behind the mic if you want for questions, and please try to keep the question short so we can get as many in as possible.
Thanks so much for this really interesting presentation. We mentioned a lot about the IOC and other organizations possibly not doing much about the kinds of problems you discussed, corruption and water, etc. What about the role of the U.S.? Do we have any role in making the Olympics somewhat of a more level playing field on these social issues? Is there anything that our government has done or should be doing, in your judgment, to deal with these problems?
Is that for me?
Anybody?
Okay. So, are you asking about government involvement
Yes,
or?
government.
Well, the IOC is technically a nonprofit, independent international organization, and they, when a games is held, whether in Rio or somewhere else, they delegate all of that responsibility to the organizing committee for the Olympic Games, which is an entity created in that country. So I don't know how we as a nation are going to have some impact on what Brazil, like what change Brazil is potentially going to make. And I'm sure you two have different opinions, but I'm not certain.
I just really do feel like going to the U.S. to transform the IOC is really like asking the wolf to guard the hen house and keep all the hens safe. Because I'm just looking at the very concrete history of Atlanta in '96, Salt Lake City, LA in '84. People should actually get Jules's book, Power Games, which is a terrific overview of a lot of these Olympic histories. And so, and I'm really thinking about what the U.S.'s plans were, for example, the Boston 2024 bid, which was pushed back by activists there and kicked out of Boston, basically. And the fact that, can you imagine if these Olympics were almost in Chicago, or at least that was the hope? You think about the issues that the Olympics bring, which is corruption, police violence, and you put displacement. In Chicago, they call that a Tuesday. And it's the idea of putting the Olympics on top of that. It just makes me less than trusting of the United States that they would do what's in the best interests of the people who usually the Olympics are built on top of.
Yeah, but it's the U.S. that's now prosecuting people. No one else did.
Because they didn't get the World Cup. And that's part of it too. I'm sorry, Steve. I don't want to just go.
No, well, I just want to respond to that.
Well, it's just that I think that one of the reasons why that they're going after FIFA so aggressively is that FIFA has actively shut out the United States from hosting the World Cup after several very aggressive bids. It created a real opening with a brand new, if you remember, Attorney General Loretta Lynch, who'd been in office, I think, for several hours by the time of the raid. It was a very popular target, because if there's one thing, people aren't big fans of the IOC generally. They really don't like FIFA.
Well, I'm just going to, jump in here. On the FIFA issue, I think also because there's this dilemma of who can make FIFA change. They clearly don't want to change themselves. Sponsors are making statements in the press, well, we might withdraw our sponsorship, right? Probably not, because you want to sell more beer or soccer balls or whatever it is. You want to be affiliated with the World Cup. So sponsors weren't going to make the change. IOC certainly would not drive that change. And I don't think any sort of countries participating in soccer, any organizations were going to be able to drive that change. And certainly Switzerland, where FIFA is based, was not going to sort of force any change within FIFA. So I don't know that anyone else other than the U.S. could have made that sort of force the change that may happen. We'll see.
Great, thank you. Next question.
I was just curious about teasing out the IOC's role in the economic troubles that the host city kind of takes on. Is it really just, about Rio in particular, I'm more interested. Is it that Rio and Brazil kind of know what they're signing up for? It's, hey, the IOC sets its parameters and the spending and the requirements, and it's on the Rio government, the Brazilian government, to then say, put her hand up and volunteer to, get in the mix? Or is there some larger culpability for the IOC to take on for even setting those parameters in place at the outset?
Well, you've put your finger on kind of the problem, is that there's this sort of perpetual jurisdictional shimmy, where one person or one jurisdiction says, hey, that's not our problem, we're the IOC just, and we're going to go to the next Olympics, we're helicoptering off and jetting off. And then you've got within Rio, you probably saw it when you were just there, Dave. The mayor saying, "Oh, that's not my issue. That's the state of Rio de Janeiro's issue." The state of Rio de Janeiro saying, "Oh, that's not my issue. That's a federal issue. We need federal funding for that." And so you raise a really interesting question about where does the accountability ultimately lie for the IOC, and maybe that's where we can come back toward national governments trying to impose some sort of leverage, whether it's the United States or whether it's France. I mean, France right now is going after some potential bribery around the Tokyo 2020 Olympics. And they're looking into a $2 million illegal payment that was allegedly made to secure the games for Tokyo. So again, you see a national government moving in to deal with this sort of para-state.
Just to that question, anyone else, Dave has a really good interview he did with the mayor, Eyes of Rio de Janeiro, where, among other things, he does exactly that kind of shimmy. It's amazing to hear. It's just like, well, that's not what we do, that's what other people do. So I recommend listening to that.
And just one follow-on on that. So one of the IOC's changes in the bid process is to add a sort of informal period at the beginning of the bid, so countries and cities can get more information and hopefully understand better what it is they're signing up for, what the requirements are, what it's actually going to take financially, logistically, and otherwise to host the games. But that being said, so Rio knew what the IOC demanded, and there are certain sort of numbers that you need, because there are 10,500 athletes competing in the Summer Olympics. Twice as many coaches and trainers and other parts of the delegation. So there are, just by the numbers, it's an enormous event to produce. So Rio knew, but the IOC also had an interest in having a games in South America. It had not been previously in South America, and so it's sort of the wants sort of counter to Dave's suggestion that games be in a couple of places. The IOC has sort of actively been looking to have the games in different locations around the world. And Rio had hosted the Pan American Games in 2007, so that was a little bit of a dress rehearsal for them on that front.
Yeah, I have two quick questions. One is regarding the Zika issue. I'm from Puerto Rico, and we were supposed to have this week 2 Major League Baseball games hosted in San Juan, and they canceled because of Zika. And it was a big upset there because we have had mosquitoes for a while. We had dengue, we had chikungunya, and now Zika is just another for the same mosquito actually. And in Miami, Florida, where you have a baseball team playing, they have Zika. So it's like we were upset and just wondering, like, we always feel that in the South, or whatever you want to call it, we were set for different standards. So going back to that, I've been following the Olympics for a while, and I always feel that both for the World Cup in Brazil and for these Olympics, I've heard all these issues that I've never heard being raised for other host cities or countries. That's one question. So I'm just wondering, like, if it's different standard. I wasn't alive for Mexico '68, but I'm sure I've read a lot, and I'm sure that, and they were writing, protesting because they have had the killings of the students before. But I'm sure that the press in the Western press covered it differently. That's one question. And the other one is about.
really, I think, important. 'Cause I think it's not just Zika. I think that there are a series of these kinds of pandemic anxieties that are a function of the 21st century that are exploited, I think, dramatically by people who have an interest in folks living in a state of fear. And I think the main people who I think suffer for that the most are in the global south, because it's so much easier to demonize, exoticize, and put the global south at arm's length. I thought the Puerto Rico, I followed that as well. The Puerto Rico Miami thing, I thought was just absolutely absurd. We can't have the 2 exhibition games in Puerto Rico, but hey, everything's fine in Miami. The other thing is just like the basic facts. And I want to be really, really clear about this so folks know. If one is interested in having a child or being part of the process of having a child, you should be deeply, deeply concerned about Zika. Those fears are very real. And the percentages, they're still working them out because there's so much people don't know, but I've heard 20%, 25% of cases of Zika-related illnesses, including some really horrific issues that people don't even know what the ramifications of those issues are going to be going forward. So those issues are very real. Take that out of the equation. What the leading doctors on this, and these are not people who are pro-Olympics or anything, what they're saying in Brazil, I'm talking about the people in Rio who are treating this, is they're saying roughly half the people who have Zika are asymptomatic. They don't even know they have it. It goes in their body, they're going. I met tons of people who had Zika. You know what Zika meant for them? It meant 3 days of aches and pains, a slight fever, then it was gone. So you're talking about something that, compared to, numerous people said to me, Zika's one thing, but dengue, you don't want to get dengue. So it's like how you feel about it when you actually live there is very different from how people are talking about it in the suites of New York or Washington, D.C. And I don't want to minimize the fears, particularly for people who are looking towards pregnancy as an option in their lives. But the hysteria around it, to me, has a very ugly undercurrent.
Yes, Sports Illustrated. Sorry to jump in.
And the fact that abortion is illegal in Brazil?
Well, I'm just going on the article in Sports Illustrated, how they're issuing 450,000 condoms to all the athletes, and that's triple the amount that
They do that anyway, so.
but I'm just, to his point about exoticizing it,
Yeah.
So it'll probably be an opportunity to talk to the panelists after the conversation, just so we can get to the
Sorry.
No apologies. There's so much we can talk about this all night, but just so we have an opportunity.
Abortion, I think it's just Indiana, but Indiana passed a law specifically curbing abortion for people with Zika concerns. Governor Mike Pence signed that. So you see the way also Zika is being used as a way to control women's reproductive rights as well. It's disgusting.
So I had 2 questions, so I've been reined in already. One was following up on the financing that somebody asked about, which had to do with, and I was going to just ask a little bit more about public-private partnerships and how funding gets used, so I'll just throw that to the side. And going with the educative forum, I'll give the multiple choice of questions to the panelists, so whatever they want to go with. I was curious if you could say, so understandably, we're talking a lot about what the IOC doesn't, where the corruption is, and we're talking a lot about vigilance, right? Police violence, corruption that happens with the funding, etc. I'm curious if you could talk about things that the IOC could do that would actually help people on the ground, that are totally within the realm of possibility. It doesn't have to do with cleaning up the water for the athletes, that are just things they could do because you've also spent time there. What could they do that would actually help conditions on the ground for Rio, or just the larger picture? The other question that I had, so here's my multiple choice too, is I was struck that your examples were both hate about politics, were both actually what I would consider to be hate crimes, because they were both so racist. And then I was struck by Dave, your rejoinder, which is that, in my wording, which is that capitalism often doesn't get parsed as politics, and therefore is invisible, if you will. So I was a little bit curious if in your research you have seen examples of people who have and have not gotten reined in, because of the examples that you gave, that illustrate a little bit more the IOC's politics, if you will, to create a little bit more, pick up on the criticism, they create a little bit more of a complicated picture of the definition of politics that you gave, if you will. Does that make sense, that question? So that's my multiple choice view.
And I think you gave some good examples.
I'm happy to talk as much as people want me to talk, but I don't want to talk too much. I want to be conscious to not hog. So, With that being said, I think the on-the-ground stuff, to me, I feel like the IOC has missed a layup with Zika, because controlling Zika, and this is like the doctors there are so frustrated, because it is not rocket science. If you want to even eliminate Zika, you know what you need? You need to eliminate standing water, and you need to have a real sewage system in the poorest neighborhoods in Rio. And it's specifically susceptible in Rio because the population is so dense. And so you got to deal with sewage, you got to deal with standing water. It costs money. It doesn't cost a lot of money. And the idea of the IOC stepping in and saying, Brazil is in a state of economic contraction, they cannot handle Zika, we are not merely concerned about the athletes, who, by the way, are going to be in fumigated climate control areas. I saw these areas where they're going to be in between competition, but we're concerned about the people of Rio. It's like, for them to go in and do that and put a couple of $1 million towards just basic fumigation of certain neighborhoods would be a layup. And the fact that they're not doing it, I think it actually says something. The fact that that hasn't been proposed, about how they view the populations where the Olympics settle. And on the second point, I don't know what happened to this athlete. If Jules can remember, I'd be so grateful. But there was an athlete, a boxer of Aboriginal descent from Australia.
Damien Hooper.
Yeah, Damien Hooper, who revealed that he was wearing an Aboriginal flag on his shirt, which is against IOC. It was considered a political statement. And he was chastised for that, but I don't know the extent to which he was punished for that. But because but it was so weird because the Aboriginal flag is actually recognized as one of Australia's flags, and yet it wasn't recognized by the IOC, and so it was seen as a political statement.
Yeah, he was not punished for that, and he was unrepentant. He said he wasn't sorry about it. He was representing his Aboriginal people as well, but he didn't get cracked down on by the IOC. He didn't wear the T-shirt after that in the actual boxing ring. I think the International Olympic Committee should start spreading the love, by which I mean money, please. And they have plenty of it. I mean, last I saw, they have about $1 billion in reserves. These tests that Dave's talking about would be a drop in the bucket, layup, as you're saying. What about the viral testing, drop in the bucket? In terms of numbers, if you're on the International Olympic Committee and you go to Rio, your per diem, if you're on the executive committee, is $900. That's not like the other stuff like hotel stuff. $900 a day per diem. If you're just a regular old member, it's $450 a day for per diem. Okay, and you're already sitting at the nice cheese platter and getting all the free cheese, so you're pretty well fed. So by contrast, you look at Rocinha, which is the largest favela in Rio. The average monthly wage there, is $240, and that statistic comes to you before the massive plunge in the economy. So there's this massive disparity here. Certain people have money, and at the very least, a gesture of goodwill would be to read the political terrain in front of you and try to help the people, as you suggested, that are on the ground. Everyday people who will never be able to afford a ticket to one of these matches or games, by the way.
And organizationally, there's a very clear distinction between what the IOC does from a governance perspective and what the organizing committee on the ground in Rio that the Brazilian Olympic Committee and the government formed after they were awarded the games. They're responsible financially for the Olympics, and the IOC gives money to the organizing committee for the Olympic Games. So it's not as though they do not spend any money on helping these cities prepare for the Olympics. And in fact, 90% of all of the IOC's billions of dollars of revenue go back out to national Olympic committees, international federations, and the organizing committees for the Olympic Games, and that definitely includes Rio.
So ideally, we would say your online hash all runs to fix all of them. Unfortunately, we don't have that time. I'm going to ask that we stack the remaining questions, and to the extent there might be some overlap, and take note, good luck, panelists, with the questions. So if we could just go through them, and then remind yourselves, we'll kind of go through the gist.
Just kind of following up on what you just spoke of, I think, at least, would you say that Rio, kind of with the help, Rio 2016, the organizing committee, with the help of the IOC, has been somewhat fiscally responsible considering the economic circumstances, what happened with the World Cup? I mean, a few things they've done, I think, the opening ceremonies, they're not spending as much as they were going to. They found another sponsor. Certain venues, they decided they're just not going to build or they're going to shrink down. Do you think that's progress? and what are some things that, some other things that you've seen that you can kind of applaud and say good on them to kind of put their foot down?
So we'll hold on to that, we're gonna stack them, and then we'll go through. I'm keeping notes so we can remind ourselves. Good question, thank you.
We're taking notes. We're taking
Good,
notes.
you're taking notes
We're
also,
good.
we all are.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for taking my question. Nice to meet you. This question is for Cameron. I really respect you for standing up here and representing the voice of the athletes in this conversation, which is often overlooked in the sort of urban planning-based or economics-based conversations. However, there needs to be a dialogue, right? And so what I want to ask is, why do sports, and may that be sports competition or sports entertainment, seem to occupy a place in global culture, if there is such a thing, which is sort of ahead of or more, maybe more pressing than housing and environment and health. And I often wonder where we place our priorities in that respect. But as an athlete, I want to hear from you. All right.
Great, thank you.
Hi, my name is Mitchell Cohen. I'm from WBAI Radio. So I want to ask how much is being orchestrated from abroad, from the US, with one crisis on top of another in Brazil, from Zika to the coup to the economic, in order to take part in the fight between the BRICS countries, which Brazil is part of, versus the TPP countries, which the United States is organizing. And how much is that really helping to orchestrate the hysteria and the panic that's being manufactured?
Thank you.
My question more has to do with the selection of host cities. We've seen organizations like FIFA and UEFA decide to split major events between two countries. I'm wondering why the Olympics hasn't gone that route, why they stick it in one city and haven't gone with, doing a whole country or splitting it between two neighboring countries. So I'm just curious on your take on that.
That's my second question.
I apologize for
No, it's
applying
okay.
rules inequally. That was unfair.
No, I made the line again, that's fine. So I want to go back to I'm a political scientist, so I really appreciate that some of us are working on sports. I wanted to go back to the definition that you gave about the political, or be left out of the Olympics. So I was just wondering, like in the Parade of Nations, that couldn't be more political, like going back, why Puerto Rico, who is a stateless nation, is there, and Palestine is not. And you could go over an hour. So I was just wondering if it's as they did in Barcelona in '92, where they have the IOA, so they have the independent Olympic athletes, if they're gonna do something like that with the Syrian refugees, or what's different this time in terms of the parade.
Hi, my name is Laura. To go back to the beginning of this conversation, when you started by addressing, I'm glad to say, the mosquito in the room, what a great image, elephant, mosquito elephant. I just want to ask, so are you saying that if the Olympics are not held in Rio, then the Brazilian government will not do what it should to help the poor people, to get them tested, to get the water cleared, or whatever is necessary to eradicate the Zika? That's what I felt like I was hearing without having it said really explicitly, and I just wanted to ask that. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we have a great series of 6 questions, and maybe this should just be free for all based on whatever takes precedence in the room. Who wants to answer what?
I'm going to jump in on the host city question. I think that's an easy one. Number 4. So your question was why not be more like FIFA, where the events and the games can be in different places. That's actually part of the new strategic plan of the IOC, that the IOC will consider bids from multiple cities and even multiple countries. So I heard discussed, and I think it's not a reality, but like Lake Placid and Montreal, for example, love working together because Lake Placid, I'm from there, it's tiny, they will never host an Olympics again. And I mean, the closest airport is like 2.5 hours, but they have the luge track and other venues that that Montreal doesn't have, but if they paired together, they could essentially, do everything. So that actually is one of the, I think, positive changes that the IOC has made in the process, in the selection process.
Yeah, is our jump in? All right, just on the last one, to be clear, like the thing about there won't be any fumigation or effort to help with Zika if the Olympics aren't here. That's what people said to me in the street with a very sort of cynical bent. Like this idea of the only reason that this is even being talked about is the Olympics. The only reason that local government, which is usually viewed as inefficient and corrupt, is doing anything is because of the Olympics. The only reason why Eduardo País, the mayor of Rio, who I interviewed for 30 minutes, is doing anything about this is because of the Olympics. Whether or not that's true or not is a different question, but that was a widespread belief because they are doing a lot. They're putting money into. I was in the lab where they're doing this. They're actually trying to genetically create a mosquito that mates with the existing mosquito, and then the babies die at birth. Now, that sounds pretty cool, but then you think to yourself, gee, genetic modification, disease, mosquitoes, what could go wrong? It's a little bit terrifying, but the bigger issue is that they're throwing money into it because of what the people on the ground said were Olympic concerns. País was like, no, what are you talking about? Oh, this is all about helping Olympics. That has nothing to do with it. By the way, Eduardo País is going to be teaching next year at Columbia. So if anybody here has any issues with what we're talking about, I take the 1 train and go tell them yourself.
So curveball, does anybody here speak and or feel comfortable translating Spanish or Portuguese?
Eu fiz mestrado em Ciências Sociais sobre os impactos dos Jogos Olímpicos no Rio de Janeiro e, sobretudo, no Parque Olímpico, onde vão ser realizados os Jogos. E eu quero saber a posição da mídia estrangeira sobre esse movimento de famílias de suas casas por causa dos Jogos.
Entendido? Did you get most of it?
Yeah.
Okay.
I understand.
Yes, sir. So you're a master's student, and you're here studying the impacts of Rio de Janeiro, in particular on a community called Vila Autódromo. And you were asking about that. Do you want anything specific about Vila Autódromo? Algo específico? Podemos falar? Okay, obrigado. So yeah, I mean, both Dave and I have visited this community called Vila Autódromo, which is perched on the edge of a park, a vibrant favela, Olympic Park, a vibrant favela. It's been there since the 1960s. It started as a fishing community, and it has been totally decimated by the Olympics. From the 5 months that I lived there, I went there over and over again, and it just kept more and more houses were getting cut away and just bulldozed down. So many powerful stories of amazingly courageous people standing up against the odds there. One of them, who I had the good fortune of meeting, was Luisa Elena Costa Berta, who she is a candomblé practitioner, and her orisha, her sort of like goddess, came from the water right in the lagoon where the community is perched. And so she can't just hop up and go to Parque Carioca, which is basically a big building where they're asking people to move, a big apartment complex. She can't go there because she has real reasons why she needs to be on the lagoon. And there's countless stories. I mean, Dave can tell you heartbreaking stories. And one thing I think is really important to keep in mind, you'll hear stories from Eduardo País, who Dave had the good fortune of interviewing. And I really think when you see him up on the screen there, you should bring a degree of healthy skepticism to what he says, because he is the king of flip-flopping. And Vila Autódromo is just one example. He's like, oh, they're all going to be able to stay? Oh, no, they all have to go. Oh, we're going to build all new houses for them? Oh, wait, there's no way we can do that. Oh, we're going to give you $1.2 million free tickets for the Olympics for those who can't afford it? Oops, sorry, I'm not going to do that. I could keep going, right? But it's especially poignant when you think about Vila Autódromo and what's going on there.
So let's do some triage with the few remaining we have in the queue.
There are a ton more questions too.
That's what I'm saying, Brad. Yes.
With the pre-queue. a couple of things. First of all, about Rio and how they're putting on the Olympics. Like I have my smallest concern in this entire discussion is how Rio is going to put on the Olympics, and are they going to be able to do it successfully? Not only because I think there are more important things to be concerned about, but because if there's one thing that Rio knows how to do is throw a global party, which is yet another reason why I think the Zika stuff is just smacks of like utter ignorance about the millions of people who go to Rio every year and the number of global events that take place in Rio and have been taking place there on a pretty regular basis over the last decade and a half. And I say this, they are very conscious of how it looks, very conscious. Like I was able to do a tour of Olympic Park, and in one of the stadiums, they showed me about how the stadium was basically put together in almost like a Lego style. Like you had to see it like if you yanked on anything in the stadium, it would literally come apart. It was basically large pieces of Lego put this together. I'm being totally serious. And they were like, what we're going to do is take this apart. And then the person doing the tour named 3 favela communities and said, this will all be transported to those communities to build schools. As if to say, like, this is a benefit of the Olympics. You know, we build this out of Lego and then we move it and then build schools. But it's like, and you know, you're tempted to sort of like nod your head and be like, wow, 3 new schools. But then it's like, wait a minute, why do we need the middleman again? Why did we have to go the Olympic part? Why can't we just build the schools? You know, why the zigzag through these kinds of budgetary problems? But so it is being put. I think it's been subject to a lot of oversight, a lot of pressure, and I also think Rio World Cup in 2014 paved the way, and also, frankly, lowered people's expectations of what the Olympics could bring. Because that's another, I mean, Rio was such a disaster from a perspective of economics, politics. I mean, there were mass protests in Brazil against the World Cup. And that's like people in New York protesting pizza. I mean, it's like people in Brazil protesting soccer. That's how badly they put it on. And so when I talked to people in Rio, one of the things that was said was, at least it's not the World Cup. And that's not exactly something you put on a brochure. At least we're not FIFA. At least I'm not Sepp Blatter. I mean, at least I'm not a Bond villain. So it's something to hang your hat on, but it's certainly, I don't think something, you know, you take home and pin on your refrigerator with a magnet.
So I was in Brazil last spring with students from NYU, and pretty much everyone we talked to had not very positive reaction and comments about the World Cup. And I would say what I heard was not so much it's not the World Cup, but there seemed to be some more, I would say, positive feeling about the Olympics. And I think the IOC has definitely a different agenda than FIFA. And there is legacy, and it's certainly not in the IOC's interest for cities now to hold the games and do nothing with the venues afterward. It doesn't certainly does not do them any good. It's not good for the franchise. And why do cities? It's like, why do cities want to keep hosting the Olympics now? The IOC has a big challenge on its hands, and legacy is an important part of it.
So I lived in Rio from August through December, like I said, and I met 2 guys who were excited about the Olympics. So there were 2 of them, and I talked to a lot of people. So I guess we just had slightly different experiences on that front. One thing I would say with the legacy is that's an area for serious improvement for the Olympics. I mean, this legacy has almost become a word that's like sustainability. It means whatever you want. Physical sustainability, environmental sustainability. It's like this sort of empty word that means whatever you want it to, and usually it means nothing what we would like it to mean. So I'm extremely worried about the legacy of Rio, although I'm open to the possibility that we'll see a legacy of people standing up democratically in the streets and raising really important questions about it. One question was about the positive things that the IOC is doing, the International Olympic Committee, and I'm hoping that there'll be some 2-city bids. We haven't quite seen it yet among the recommendations of the Agenda 2020 recommendations, but we haven't seen any people really jump on that opportunity yet. But one thing is kind of cool maybe to keep an eye on this summer is the IOC is funding a team of refugees who, some of them are from Syria and other places, and Thomas Bach, who Cameron had mentioned before, is hoping to have between 5 and 10 athletes who the IOC is helping to train up. And so that could be some other athletes for us to root on this summer at those Olympics.
I know we didn't get to all the questions, but to be respectful of your time, our panelists, we can give Dave the very last word.
I don't want the last word.
I would also say that there's still plenty of wine to drink and books to purchase and also be signed by, I think, the authors if they have the time. And you can also probably ask them your questions directly. So, Dave, make it good.
I'm not going to make it good. I just think what Mitchell asked about the BRIC countries is really important because you haven't heard about BRIC in the last couple. That was very fashionable about 10 years ago. Brazil, Russia, India, China. This idea of these countries coming together to actually offer some form of international competition to the United States in global leadership or in the United Nations. And I think without question, the Olympics and the awarding of the Olympics to Brazil, as well as the awarding of the Olympics to China in 2008, I think it was a part of that. It was this idea of people talk about why are sports so much in the fabric internationally. One reason is because we love sports. Another reason is that sports are very useful for people who run these countries and always have been. As long as there have been nation states, sports are extremely important. And the idea that the BRIC countries were going to lead the 21st century, I think the Olympics and FIFA got on board with that idea. The problem, which they didn't foresee, was the drop in the price of oil. And it's so frightening that's all it really took. But the drop in the price of oil has meant you don't really hear about BRIC as much anymore. Brazil is in economic contraction, and it's in a position right now where I do think that a lot of the fears about Brazil, the Zika stuff, is in a lot of ways people and media forces in the United States and people in government sort of kicking back a little bit. Because there's no question, when Brazil was got the Olympics, they were like, yeah, United States, what did Chicago come in, third? You know, and there was a bit of intra-imperial boasting, if you will, and this idea of we are the country of the future, you are the country of the past, and now it's being kicked back in Brazil's face. The problem is who is actually going to pay the price for that in the end, and it's not going to be the people who are making that bid for the Olympics. It's going to be the people who actually have to live and die in Rio de Janeiro.
I think that's as powerful a point as any to end on.